The two municipal vehicles that pulled up to the curb on Hawthorne Street did not have their sirens on. There were no flashing lights casting dramatic shadows across the damp pavement, no aggressive knocking, and no neighborhood spectators peering through their blinds. It was a Tuesday morning, quiet and steeped in the heavy coastal fog that always clung to our town of Oakhaven until noon. I stood on my own front porch across the street, a mug of black coffee growing cold in my hand, watching the two investigators from the State Bureau of Economic Fraud step out of their sedans. They wore grey suits that matched the sky. They walked up the cobblestone path of my sister's meticulously restored colonial home, a path I had laid myself brick by brick 3 years ago, and pressed the doorbell. They were waiting at her door, not because of a stolen inheritance, not because of a violent crime, and certainly not because of a petty family dispute over a baby's name. They were there because of what that name represented on a set of forged municipal blueprints, and because I had finally stopped fixing my sister's mistakes. For 12 years, Delia and I ran Elliott Architectural Preservation. We were a local institution in this coastal Oregon town, specializing in restoring the rotting, salt-battered Victorian and craftsman homes that lined the cliffs. Delia was the face of the operation. She was the one who could walk into a hostile zoning board meeting with a box of artisan scones and walk out with a variance that no other contractor could secure. She had a way of making people feel like they were part of a grand historical legacy just by shaking her hand. I, on the other hand, was the archivist, the drafter, the one who sat in the basement of the county courthouse, pulling century-old permits, studying load-bearing walls, and making sure the structures didn't collapse into the Pacific. We were a perfect ecosystem. Delia brought in the money and the prestige, and I kept us grounded in reality. She had also, in a very real sense, saved me. Years ago, when my 20s were swallowed by a series of paralyzing depressive episodes and financial ruin, Delia paid my rent. She gave me a job when I couldn't get out of bed. She anchored me to the world, and because of that, I operated under a silent, permanent debt. I let her dictate the terms of our business, our salaries, and our lives. The balance only shifted when I decided to become a mother. I was 36, unmarried, and entirely uninterested in the traditional path. Through a chaotic and emotionally draining process, I became a foster parent to a 2-year-old boy whose biological parents had permanently relinquished their rights. He was a quiet, observant child with a shock of dark hair, and he needed a home that was stable, predictable, and entirely his own. I began the lengthy legal process of formal adoption. Up to that point, he was known to the state as Baby Boy 402, having never been officially named on his birth certificate due to the circumstances of his birth. I decided to name him Elias. It wasn't a random choice. Elias Thorne was the name of Oakhaven's original architect, a man whose blueprints I had studied for over a decade. His designs were characterized by resilience, deep foundations, reinforced timber, structures built to withstand the harshest coastal storms. It felt like a promise to the boy. I would build a life for him that could not be washed away. When I told Delia my decision over lunch at a seafood place near the marina, her reaction was not just hostile, it was fundamentally bizarre. She dropped her fork, the metal clattering loudly against the ceramic plate. Her eyes widened, scanning my face as if searching for a hidden joke. When she realized I was serious, the color drained from her cheeks only to be replaced by a blotchy, uneven red. She leaned across the table, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She told me I couldn't use the name. She said she had claimed it first. I stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of the statement. Delia was 41, aggressively child-free by choice, and had spent the last decade prioritizing our business expansion over any personal relationships. She had never once mentioned the name Elias, nor had she ever expressed a fleeting interest in motherhood. I tried to laugh it off, assuming it was a strange manifestation of sisterly control. I told her the paperwork was already in motion. The adoption was in its final administrative phase, and the name change petition had been submitted to the family court. Delia didn't argue. She simply stood up, left a $50 bill on the table, and walked out of the restaurant. I should have known then that something was wrong, but my blind spot for my sister was vast. I assumed she was having a midlife crisis, mourning a hypothetical future she had chosen to abandon. I gave her space, focusing on preparing my house for Elias's permanent transition. 3 days later, I received a phone call from the social worker handling my case. Her tone, usually warm and supportive, was clipped and professional. She informed me that an anonymous complaint had been filed regarding my mental fitness to adopt. The complaint cited detailed, highly specific medical records from my depressive episodes a decade ago, records that only my family knew about. The caller had alleged that my current living situation was unstable and that I was emotionally volatile. The social worker explained that while they didn't immediately believe the anonymous tip, protocol required them to suspend the finalization of the adoption pending a full psychological evaluation and a secondary home study. Elias, who had been staying with me on a trial transition, was to be temporarily placed back in the neutral foster home until the investigation was cleared. When the state vehicle pulled away from my house with my son in the back seat, I stood on the porch until my legs went numb. The betrayal was so precise, so surgically targeted at my deepest vulnerability, that I didn't need to guess who had made the call. Only Delia knew the name of the psychiatrist I had seen 12 years ago. Only Delia knew the exact dates of my lowest moments. But the cruelty didn't make sense. Delia could be manipulative, but she was never destructive without a profit motive. Ruining my adoption didn't gain her anything financially. It only derailed our business, as I was entirely non-functional for the next 48 hours. I dragged myself to the county archives on a Friday afternoon, desperate for a distraction from the crushing silence of my empty house. I sat at my usual drafting table in the basement of the records building, surrounded by the smell of decaying paper and dust. I needed to understand what had triggered her reaction. It wasn't about jealousy. Delia only fought for things that had a monetary value. I started pulling the recent permit applications submitted under Elliott Architectural Preservation. If Delia was maneuvering, there would be a paper trail. Marcus, the county clerk, wheeled a cart of heavy, canvas-bound ledgers past my desk. He was a meticulous man who took the historical integrity of Oakhaven far more seriously than the elected officials did. We had shared hundreds of quiet afternoons in this basement over the years. He stopped by my table, glancing at the stack of routine residential permits I was sorting through. He adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a mild expression of confusion. He asked why I was looking at residential permits when our firm was in the middle of the Thorn Mill acquisition. I stopped. I placed my pencil down on the desk very carefully. I told Marcus I wasn't aware we were bidding on the Thorn Mill. The Thorn Mill was the largest derelict property in Oakhaven. Sitting on 20 acres of prime coastal real estate, it was a protected historical site that developers had been drooling over for a decade. The zoning laws, however, were notoriously impenetrable. The original town charter, drafted in 1888, placed the mill in a perpetual heritage trust. No commercial development could occur on the land unless the project was explicitly spearheaded by a direct descendant of the Thorn family, or, as a bizarre legal loophole in the charter stated, a resident of Oakhaven, who bore the exact namesake of the founder, maintaining the historical continuity of the town's stewardship. It was an eccentric, archaic legal clause that the modern zoning board treated as an unbreakable covenant. Marcus looked uncomfortable. He pulled a thick manila folder from the bottom shelf of his cart and slid it across the table to me. Inside was a preliminary development proposal submitted to the Oakhaven Heritage Board. It outlined a multi-million-dollar conversion of the Thorn Mill into a luxury boutique hotel and commercial plaza. The applicant was a newly formed LLC called the Elias Thorn Heritage Trust. The principal director of the trust was listed as Delia Elliott. I flipped to the legal justification section of the proposal. There, in crisp black ink, Delia's lawyers had argued that the project bypassed the commercial zoning restrictions because a member of the Elliott household was the legal namesake of the founder, Elias Thorn. I stared at the date on the filing. It was stamped 3 weeks ago. 2 days after, I had excitedly told Delia about my intention to adopt Elias and give him that specific name. The architecture of her plan materialized in front of me with sickening clarity. Delia hadn't claimed the name for a future child of her own. She had claimed it for a corporation. She needed my son to be named Elias, but she couldn't allow me to finalize the adoption on my terms, because as his sole legal guardian, I would have complete control over his identity and any legal entities attached to him. I would never have allowed a 2-year-old to be used as a pawn in a commercial real estate flip. By filing the anonymous complaint, she had halted the adoption. I realized, with a cold, sinking feeling, what her next move would be. If I was deemed unfit to adopt, Elias would remain in the system. Delia, as my sister, with her pristine public record, her wealth and her status in the community, could easily step in, petition the court to foster him, to keep him in the family, and finalize the adoption herself. She would own the namesake. She would own the loophole. She would get the mill. My son wasn't a nephew to her. He was a zoning variance. I didn't confront her. A younger version of me, the version that believed Delia always had our best interests at heart, would have stormed into her office, demanding an explanation, crying, begging her to withdraw the complaint. But sitting in the archive, holding the fraudulent proposal, something fundamentally shifted inside me. The debt I had carried for 12 years evaporated. I needed to see how deep the rot went. I left the archives and drove to the structural engineering firm we contracted for our load-bearing assessments. Victor, the lead engineer, was a nervous man who hated conflict, but his notary stamp was required on all our final submissions to the city. I walked into his office unannounced. I didn't ask him how he was. I simply placed a copy of the Heritage Trust proposal on his desk and pointed to the notary seal on the last page. The date of the notarization was listed as April 4th. I looked Victor in the eye and reminded him that on April 4th, I was with him in Portland at a structural symposium. He hadn't brought his stamp. He hadn't notarized anything that day. Victor looked at the door, then back at the document. He began to sweat, wiping his palms on his khakis. He confessed, his voice barely above a whisper, that Delia had come to him weeks later, demanding he backdate the notary stamp on several documents relating to the Thorn Mill. She had threatened to pull all of our firm's contracts from his business if he refused. Victor's firm was struggling. Our contracts kept his lights on. He had stamped the papers, assuming it was a minor bureaucratic shortcut, not a foundational piece of a massive real estate fraud. I didn't yell at him. I simply asked him to open his official notary ledger, the bound book, where every physical stamp must be sequentially recorded by law. He opened his desk drawer and produced the ledger. We looked at the entries for April. The sequential numbers proved the manipulation. The ledger showed consecutive entries for April 10th, 11th, and 12th. Squeezed into the margin, out of sequence and in different ink, was the entry for the Thorn Trust on April 4th. It was clumsy. Delia was arrogant, used to her charm covering her administrative tracks. But charm doesn't alter physical ink on a bound ledger. I asked Victor for a certified photocopy of the ledger page. He hesitated, knowing it would implicate him, but I told him plainly, he could either give it to me now or hand it directly to a state fraud investigator when the subpoena arrived. He made the copy. I spent the weekend organizing the documents. I had the proposal, the backdated notary log, and the timeline of my adoption process. But I needed one more piece to secure the chain of evidence. I needed to prove intent. I needed to prove she had fabricated the complaint against me specifically to leverage the child for the land grant. I logged into our company's shared cloud server. Because I handled all the back-end operations, I had administrative access to Delia's professional email archives. I spent 14 hours searching through her correspondence with her real estate attorneys. At 3 a.m. on Sunday, I found it. It wasn't a smoking gun confession, but it was enough. It was an email from her lawyer, dated the morning after our lunch, where I revealed the baby's name. The lawyer wrote, "Regarding the namesake loophole for the Thorn property, if your sister finalizes the adoption, she holds the proxy for the minor. You would need legal guardianship of the child to act as the trust's director. Are you pursuing primary custody?" Delia had replied 3 minutes later. "I'm handling my sister. The boy will be under my custody before the Heritage Board votes." She had reduced my motherhood, my son's future, and my mental health to an obstacle in a real estate transaction. I printed the emails. I placed them in a heavy, waterproof folder, along with the notary logs and the forged proposal. On Monday morning, the Oakhaven Heritage Board was scheduled to hold a preliminary public hearing on the Thorn Mill development. Delia had prepared for this for months. She had invited local politicians, wealthy investors, and the Historical Society. It was meant to be her crowning achievement, the moment she secured the contract that would make her millions. I did not go to the meeting to cause a scene. I went to the state capitol, a 2-hour drive away, to the Bureau of Economic Fraud. I sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit office with a senior investigator. I didn't frame the story as a family dispute. I framed it as corporate fraud, forgery, and the manipulation of municipal zoning laws. I laid out the timeline. I presented the fake notary logs, which constituted a felony. I provided the emails demonstrating the premeditated intent to manipulate a state adoption proceeding to secure a commercial contract. The investigator didn't offer me a tissue or sympathetic words. He looked at the documents, asked me clarifying questions about the municipal charter, and slowly began taking notes. When he saw the notary log and the timestamps on the emails, his demeanor shifted from bureaucratic indifference to sharp, focused attention. This wasn't hearsay, this was a paper trail. I drove back to Oakhaven in silence. I knew what I had done. I had not just stopped Delia, I had essentially detonated my own livelihood. Elliott Architectural Preservation was intertwined with Delia's name. When she went down for fraud, the business would be blacklisted. The city would revoke our licenses. Everything I had built over 12 years would be gone. That was the price I had to pay to get my son back. I paid it without hesitation. I did not go to Delia's house that night. I did not answer her phone calls. I sat in my quiet home, looking at the empty bedroom I had painted for Elias, and I waited. Which brings us to Tuesday morning. I stood on my porch, watching the 2 investigators approach Delia's door. She opened it wearing a silk robe, a cup of tea in her hand, her expression shifting from polite confusion to rigid shock as they presented their badges and a search warrant for her home office. They did not arrest her in handcuffs on the lawn. It wasn't a television show. It was a methodical, quiet dismantling of her life. They went inside, and the door closed behind them. I watched as, an hour later, they carried out 2 boxes of files and her computer hard drive. Delia called me later that afternoon. Her voice was not angry, but hollow, stripped of all its usual performative confidence. She asked how I could do this to my own blood, after everything she had done for me. I told her she hadn't claimed the name, and she couldn't claim my son. Then I hung up and changed my phone number. The fallout was extensive, but bureaucratic. The Thorn Mill proposal was immediately frozen. Delia was charged with multiple counts of fraud and forgery. To avoid jail time, she agreed to a plea deal that required her to pay massive fines, barring her from holding a corporate directorship or participating in public development projects for a decade. Our business was dissolved. The state agency handling my adoption, alerted to the nature of the false complaint and the ongoing fraud investigation, expedited the dismissal of the inquiry against me. The anonymous tip was reclassified as malicious interference. 6 months later, I am no longer an executive at a prestigious preservation firm. I work a quiet, heavily structured job managing the county's physical archives, working alongside Marcus. It pays a fraction of what I used to make. I live on a strict budget. I clip coupons, and I drive a car that makes a strange rattling noise when it exceeds 50 miles an hour. But I sit in the archive basement every afternoon, surrounded by the true history of the town, uncorrupted and intact. At 4 o'clock, the bell above the archive door chimes. A woman from the local daycare walks in, holding the hand of a toddler with a shock of dark hair. He lets go of her hand and runs across the linoleum floor, his small sneakers squeaking against the polished surface. I put down my pencil and kneel on the floor to catch him. He buries his face in my shoulder, smelling of graham crackers and outside air. On the desk behind me, a newly minted birth certificate rests inside a clear plastic sleeve. It is an official, irreversible legal document stamped by the state. It lists my name as the sole mother and his name as Elias. He doesn't own any property. He isn't the director of a trust, and he isn't a loophole. He is just a boy standing on a foundation that will never wash away. The door closing behind the state investigators on that foggy Tuesday morning wasn't the neat surgical end to the nightmare that I had hoped for. In a town like Oakhaven, a closed door is just an invitation for the whispers to start, and Delia was a master at controlling the narrative. I had foolishly assumed that the presence of the Bureau of Economic Fraud would shatter her authority instantly. I underestimated the sheer, terrifying momentum of a woman who had never been told no. By Wednesday afternoon, Delia had retained Richard Vance, the most aggressive defense attorney in the county, a man whose specialty was burying municipal investigations under mountains of procedural injunctions. And her first target wasn't the fraud charge. It was me. She couldn't deny that the Thorn Mill documents had been forged, but her legal strategy was a masterpiece of deflection. Vance filed a civil countersuit against me, alleging corporate espionage and malicious sabotage. The narrative they spun to the Oakhaven Heritage Board and the local press was sickeningly plausible to those who only knew Delia's public persona. She claimed that I, the unstable, jealous younger sister, with a documented history of mental health crises, had fabricated the entire scheme to steal control of Elliott Architectural Preservation. She suggested that the backdated notary logs were my doing, an attempt to frame her because she had, out of deep familial concern, raised private doubts about my fitness to adopt a child. It was a brilliant, vicious maneuver. By tying the fraud investigation directly to the anonymous CPS complaint she had filed, she muddied the waters. To the outside world, it looked like a bitter, localized family feud spilling over into the business, rather than a calculated real estate conspiracy. Because of the countersuit and the lingering CPS investigation, Elias remained trapped in the foster system. The temporary neutral placement was extended. I was allowed supervised visits twice a week in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room at the County Family Services building. The first time I walked in and saw him sitting on a plastic mat, clutching a faded yellow toy truck, my chest felt hollowed out by a physical, gnawing ache. He looked up, his dark eyes wide and confused, and ran to me, burying his face in my coat. He didn't understand why he couldn't come home. He didn't understand why his bedroom, the one I had painstakingly painted with sailboats, was suddenly off limits. I held him tightly, whispering promises I was terrified I wouldn't be allowed to keep. The social worker, a weary woman named Mrs. Gable, watched from the corner, taking notes on a clipboard. Delia's lawyer had successfully petitioned to have Mrs. Gable scrutinize every interaction I had with Elias, looking for any sign of the emotional volatility Delia had claimed I possessed. I had to remain perfectly composed. If I cried too hard, it was instability. If I showed anger toward the situation, it was a lack of emotional regulation. I was performing my own sanity while my life was being systematically dismantled. Meanwhile, Elliott Architectural Preservation was bleeding to death. Our accounts were frozen by court order, pending the fraud investigation. Clients, spooked by the front-page articles in the local paper detailing the forgery allegations, began pulling their contracts. The historic downtown renovation project, a massive undertaking we had secured just 3 months prior, cancelled our retainer and hired a firm out of Portland. Delia, legally barred from the company offices during the investigation, continued to host lavish support dinners at her home, rallying the town's elite. She played the victim flawlessly, shedding perfectly timed tears over her wineglass about how her beloved sister's tragic mental decline was destroying their legacy. I was completely isolated. The contractors who used to greet me warmly at the lumberyard now looked away when I walked down the aisles. The zoning board members wouldn't return my calls. I had spent 12 years working in the shadows to make Delia look like a visionary, and without her protective halo, the town viewed me with deep suspicion. I realized that sitting back and waiting for the state investigators to slowly untangle Delia's financial web wasn't going to save Elias. The bureaucracy moved at a glacial pace, and family court was operating on a different, much faster timeline. Delia had filed a formal petition for temporary guardianship of Elias, arguing that since she was his prospective aunt and the only stable family member, keeping him in the system was cruel. The court had scheduled a preliminary custody hearing for the following month. If the judge granted her petition, Elias would be legally placed in her home. She would secure the namesake for the Thorn Mill loophole before the fraud charges could ever stick. I needed to break her narrative, and I needed to do it outside of the courtroom. The backdated notary logs were a strong piece of evidence, but they were technical. The emails showing her intent were circumstantial enough that a good lawyer could argue she was simply trying to protect the family business from my alleged instability. I needed proof that Delia's manipulation of the Thorn Mill wasn't an isolated incident triggered by our recent dispute, but a long-standing pattern of systemic, deliberate fraud that proved her fundamental unfitness as a guardian. I went back to the county archives. Marcus, the clerk, was the only person in Oakhaven who still spoke to me normally. He understood the sanctity of records, and he knew that the ink on Victor's notary ledger hadn't lied. I asked him for access to the deepest, most restricted section of the municipal vaults, the original undigitized property tax assessments from the early 2000s, right around the time Delia first launched our firm. If Delia was willing to forge a municipal document to secure a 20-acre heritage site, she hadn't learned that trick overnight. She had practiced. I spent 2 weeks in the subterranean vault, breathing in the smell of mildew and dry rot, cross-referencing every single property Delia had ever purchased or restored in her own name before I officially joined the firm as a partner. I was looking for anomalies, sudden zoning changes, variances granted without the required public comment periods. It was grueling, tedious work, the kind of obsessive pattern matching that Delia always mocked me for. But on the 14th day, shivering in the damp air of the archive, I found it. It wasn't a massive commercial property. It was a modest, historic residential home on the South Ridge, purchased by Delia 14 years ago. According to the city records, the property had been heavily discounted because of a restrictive covenant preventing any modern additions or subdivisions, as it sat on an unstable coastal fault line. But 3 months after Delia bought it, a new structural engineering report was filed with the city, declaring the fault line dormant and the bedrock stable. The restrictive covenant was lifted. Delia immediately subdivided the lot, sold the back half to a developer for a massive profit, and used that seed money to launch Elliott Architectural Preservation. I pulled the microfilm copy of the engineering report that had magically lifted the restriction. I stared at the signature at the bottom. It belonged to an engineer named Arthur Vance. The name felt like a cold stone dropping into my stomach. I recognized it. Arthur Vance was Richard Vance's father. He had been the head of the County Zoning Commission 15 years ago, right before he retired. Delia hadn't just hired a bulldog defense attorney to fight my fraud allegations. She had hired the son of the man who helped her commit her very first act of real estate fraud. She was blackmailing her own lawyer's family legacy to ensure he kept her out of prison and won her custody of my son. I sat in the dim light of the archive, my hands trembling as I held the photocopies. The depth of the corruption was staggering. It wasn't just my sister. It was a carefully woven web of municipal favors and buried secrets that had funded our entire lives. By pulling this thread, I wasn't just going to destroy Delia. I was going to implicate one of the most powerful legal families in Oakhaven. I packed the documents into my briefcase. The custody hearing was in 3 days. I had to decide if I was willing to burn the entire town to the ground to get my boy back. I did not take the 14-year-old engineering report to the state investigators, nor did I take it to the press. A younger, more vindictive version of myself might have wanted to see the Vance family name dragged through the mud alongside Delia's, but I was no longer interested in theatrical justice. I was operating with the cold, pragmatic calculus of a mother trying to extract her child from a burning building. If I exposed Arthur Vance, the ensuing scandal would take years to untangle in the courts. Elias didn't have years. He had 3 days before a family court judge would decide his permanent placement. I needed to use the corruption, not expose it. I needed to apply pressure to the exact load-bearing pillar that was holding up Delia's legal defense. The next morning, I walked into the law offices of Vance and Associates. It was a sprawling suite of glass and mahogany overlooking the Oakhaven Marina, paid for by decades of municipal influence. I didn't have an appointment. I simply told the receptionist that I was Delia Elliott's sister and that I had the original drafts of the Thorn Mill proposal. Within 3 minutes, I was escorted into Richard Vance's private office. Richard was a polished man in his early 50s, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He offered me a tight professional smile that did not reach his eyes, motioning for me to sit. He assumed I was there to negotiate a surrender, to beg for a settlement that would keep me out of bankruptcy in exchange for dropping my opposition to the custody petition. I did not sit down. I unlatched my briefcase and pulled out a single clear plastic sleeve containing the photocopied property deed from 14 years ago, attached to the structural engineering report signed by his father. I placed it perfectly in the center of his immaculate desk. Richard looked at the document. For a few seconds, his expression remained perfectly neutral, a trained lawyer's mask. But I watched his eyes track the signature at the bottom of the page. I watched the microscopic tightening of his jaw, the slight pause in his breathing. He knew exactly what he was looking at. I kept my voice low and completely steady. I told him that I knew his father had falsified a seismic bedrock report to help my sister bypass a restrictive covenant, netting her the seed money for her entire empire. I told him that I had the original microfilm copies locked in a secure location, along with the paper trail of the subsequent land sale. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, folding his hands. He tried to brush it off, his voice dripping with condescension. He reminded me that the statute of limitations on a 14-year-old municipal zoning violation had long expired. He told me I was grasping at straws, trying to blackmail an officer of the court with ancient history because I was losing my mind. I agreed with him. I told him the state could not prosecute his father criminally, but I also reminded him that the Oakhaven Heritage Board, the same board currently evaluating the Thorn Mill project, had no statute of limitations on retroactively invalidating fraudulent land partitions. If I handed this file to the state investigators currently breathing down Delia's neck, they would open a forensic audit of every single property transaction Delia had ever touched. They would find his father's signature. I leaned over his desk, resting my hands on the polished wood. I told him that he was currently running for a seat on the state appellate court. I asked him how his political donors would react when it made the front page of the Portland papers that his father had taken bribes to build residential homes on an active coastal fault line. I asked him if defending Delia Elliott's fraudulent custody petition was worth detonating his family's legacy and his own political future. The silence in the office was absolute. The ambient hum of the air conditioning felt deafening. Richard Vance stared at me, the polished veneer cracking just enough to reveal the cold, calculating panic beneath. He was assessing the structural integrity of his own life, and he found it lacking. He realized in that moment that Delia had lied to him by omission. She had hired him as a shield, never disclosing that she was holding a live grenade that could destroy his family. I gave him my terms. They were simple, and they were non-negotiable. He was to immediately withdraw Delia's petition for guardianship of Elias. He was to formally recuse himself as her defense attorney in the Thorn Mill fraud case, citing an irreconcilable conflict of interest. If he did those two things, the file on his father would remain in the dark archives where I found it. I would let him walk away, and I would let Delia face the state investigators on her own. Richard did not argue. He did not threaten a countersuit. He simply picked up the file on his desk, slid it back into my briefcase, and handed it to me. He told me to have a good day. The custody hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. The courtroom was small, smelling of floor wax and old wood. I sat at the petitioner's table alone. Delia walked in 10 minutes late, wearing a tailored navy suit, looking every inch the aggrieved, wealthy aunt ready to rescue a child from a tragic situation. She sat at the respondent's table, glancing back at the heavy wooden doors, waiting for Richard Vance to arrive and perform his legal magic. The judge took the bench and called the docket. Delia stood up, looking flustered, and asked for a brief recess because her counsel had not yet arrived. The judge looked down at his paperwork over the rim of his glasses. He informed her that Richard Vance had filed an emergency motion of withdrawal with the clerk's office at 8:00 a.m. that morning. He had officially dropped her as a client and, on her behalf, had formally withdrawn the petition for temporary guardianship of baby boy 402. I watched my sister's face as the architecture of her reality collapsed. The blood drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking suddenly fragile and hollow. She stammered, demanding to speak to Richard, claiming there had to be a mistake. She looked across the aisle at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending panic. She realized that she had been outmaneuvered, not in a screaming match, not in a public spectacle, but in the quiet, ruthless language of leverage that she had taught me. Without a competing petition, and with the state having cleared the anonymous complaint against me upon discovering Delia's impending fraud indictment, the judge moved swiftly. He reinstated my status as the primary adoptive placement. I left the courthouse without speaking to Delia. There was nothing left to say. The debt was paid, the partnership was severed, and the illusion of our sisterhood was permanently dissolved. 2 hours later, I pulled into the parking lot of the County Family Services building. Mrs. Gable was waiting for me in the lobby. She didn't have her clipboard. She was holding Elias's hand. He was wearing a small red jacket, holding his faded yellow toy truck. When he saw me, he froze for a fraction of a second, as if afraid it was another temporary visit in the sterile room. I dropped to my knees on the linoleum floor. He let go of Mrs. Gable's hand and ran to me, crashing into my chest with a force that knocked the breath out of my lungs. I buried my face in his dark hair, inhaling the scent of him, feeling the solid, living weight of my son in my arms. I cried, not because I was unstable, but because I had won. The aftermath of that week played out exactly as I had engineered it, leading to the quiet, diminished life I live now. Delia, stripped of her top-tier legal defense, was devoured by the state investigators. The Thorn Mill project was permanently revoked. She took the plea deal, paid the fines that bankrupted her personal accounts, and became a pariah in Oak Haven. We have not spoken a single word to each other since that morning in the courtroom. I paid a severe price for my autonomy. Elliott Architectural Preservation was liquidated. My reputation in the high-end development world was collateral damage in Delia's downfall. I lost the company vehicle, the comfortable salary, and the prestige. But I gained the absolute, unshakable ownership of my own life. It is late afternoon now. The coastal fog is beginning to roll back in off the Pacific, blurring the sharp edges of the town. I sit at my drafting table in the basement of the county archives, sorting through a stack of original permits from 1912. The pay is meager, but the work is honest, rooted in preservation rather than exploitation. Marcus nods to me from across the room as he locks up the main vault for the evening. Elias is sitting on a rug near my desk, completely absorbed in constructing a tower out of wooden blocks. He is 3 years old now. He is observant, resilient, and entirely mine. I watch him carefully place a block on top of his structure, testing its balance with a small, steady hand. He looks up at me and smiles, a bright, uncomplicated expression of trust. I smile back, reaching out to tap the official state-stamped birth certificate resting in its plastic sleeve on the corner of my desk. His name is Elias. He is not a loophole, he is not a pawn, and he is not a secret. He is the first real thing I have ever built, and the only foundation that matters.
Editor. The infographic presents the story as more than a conflict between two sisters. It shows how family loyalty, psychological manipulation, legal systems, and economic ambition collide when one person begins to treat another human being as a tool. At the center is a mother preparing to adopt Elias, a vulnerable child who needs safety, identity, and a permanent home. For her, the name Elias represents strength and stability. For Delia, the same name becomes a commercial opportunity connected to an old legal loophole and a valuable real estate project. This difference reveals the central moral conflict. The mother sees Elias as a child with emotional needs, while Delia sees him as a legal instrument. Her behavior reflects control, entitlement, and strategic manipulation. She is not simply jealous of the adoption. She wants authority over the child because his identity can help her gain access to the Thorn Mill development. To remove her sister from the process, she weaponizes private information about past depression and files a false complaint questioning her mental fitness. The infographic highlights how mental health stigma can be used to discredit capable people, especially when institutions must investigate accusations before they are proven. The timeline explains how the situation develops from a private dispute into a serious fraud investigation. The adoption is delayed, archive records expose the property scheme, forged documents are discovered, and a backdated notary record creates a clear paper trail. Emails then reveal Delia's intention to gain custody of Elias before the Heritage Board vote. These records matter because manipulation depends on secrecy, but fraud leaves evidence. Signatures, dates, official logs, property records, and written communication become stronger than reputation or charm. The story also explores coercive control inside families. Delia once supported her sister during a period of depression, creating a sense of permanent debt. Because of this emotional imbalance, the mother tolerated years of control over their business and personal decisions. Her transformation begins when she understands that gratitude does not require lifelong submission. Protecting Elias forces her to establish boundaries, investigate the truth, and accept the loss of status, income, and family connection. The contrast between the sisters is a contrast between exploitation and protection. Delia builds influence through image, charm, fear, and institutional connections. The mother responds with patience, documentation, ethical clarity, and strategic resistance. Her resilience does not mean she feels no fear or grief. It means she continues acting responsibly while experiencing both. The final message is that children must never become bargaining chips in adult conflicts. Elias is not a loophole, a corporate asset, or proof of social status. He is a child whose identity deserves protection. By choosing truth over prestige and stability over wealth, the mother creates the only foundation that truly matters. Her victory is not the destruction of Delia's career. It is the restoration of Elias's right to belong to a safe and honest home.